Among the many infectious diseases that claimed countless lives for centuries, the plague always held a special place. It struck the imagination with its deadly power and was often seen as divine punishment. For Europeans of the 14th to 18th centuries, plague outbreaks were a terrifying part of daily life, and the history of the Old World cannot be understood without this dreadful disease. The plague was not the only epidemic. Humanity faced smallpox, measles, syphilis, cholera, typhus, and influenza. Some of these wiped out entire nations and even brought down states. Yet among this long chain of scourges, the plague stood apart, regarded as the very embodiment of disaster. It is no coincidence that the Latin pestis means scourge or destruction, while the English plague comes from plaga, wound or calamity. These names reflect the horror of a disease from which there was no escape. 3 waves, microorganisms that cause infectious diseases, have always thrived on civilization. Most major epidemics require dense populations and emerge alongside large cities and active human movement. Through trade routes, plague from Central Asia spread across Eurasia at least 3 times in history, killing millions. Though these outbreaks never affected the whole world, they are known as pandemics. From Greek pandemia, all the people. First wave. The first pandemic began in Central Asia in the mid-6th century during the reign of Emperor Justinian I and reached Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The plague spread throughout the Mediterranean, North Africa, and beyond, with outbreaks lasting until the 8th century. Estimates suggest 30 to 50 million deaths, though ancient statistics remain uncertain. Second wave. After centuries of silence, plague returned in the mid-14th century. The Black Death likely began in the 1330s. China reached Crimea and from there spread to Sicily in 1347. Between 1348 to 1352, it swept through Europe, killing up to 1/3 of its population, between 50 and 200 million worldwide. England may have lost half its people, needing 250 years to recover. Plague kept returning until the 18th century. Seville lost half its residents in 1649, Naples over half in 1656, Marseille lost 140,000 in 1657, 1720 to 1722. An outbreak struck Moscow in 1771 and Istanbul in 1778. In the Ottoman Empire, plague persisted into the 19th century. Third wave. The third pandemic started in China in the mid-19th century and lasted until the 1920s. It spread with ship rats to India, the Americas, Africa, and Southeast Asia, killing about 12 million people. For comparison, the Spanish flu, 1918 to 1920, caused around 50 million deaths, causes and the guilty. The plague, striking everyone without distinction, raised 2 urgent questions. Why does it come, and how can one survive? Divine punishment. In the Middle Ages, most people believed the plague was God's punishment for human sins. The Church called for repentance, prayers, fasting, and processions. People sought protection from saints. Saint Sebastian was seen as a defender, his body pierced with arrows resembling the sores of plague. Saint Roch was venerated for surviving the disease himself and being miraculously healed. Poisoned air. Physicians explained the epidemic through miasmas, toxic vapors rising from rotting bodies, swamps, or even from planetary alignments and comets. To protect themselves, people carried herbs and flowers, burned incense, and fumigated their homes. This was the origin of the iconic plague doctor, in a long cloak and a mask with a beak filled with spices and aromatics, meant to purify the air. Often, these versions overlapped. Even scholars claim that God sent the plague, but used poisoned air as his instrument, scapegoats, and the real culprit. Fear of the plague led people to look for scapegoats. Jews, lepers, sorcerers, beggars, and foreigners were often accused of spreading the disease. Riots broke out in many cities, and in Geneva and Milan, alleged poisoner plots led to the execution of innocent people. In reality, the culprit was the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Humans were merely accidental victims. The bacterium lives in rodents. An infection occurs through flea bites or other means. The transmission is simple and deadly. A flea bites an infected animal, the bacteria multiply inside it, and when the flea bites a human, it injects the infection into the bloodstream. The bacterium causes several forms of plague, the most common being bubonic. Once in the lymph nodes, the bacteria multiply rapidly, forming painful buboes, which, if untreated, can lead to death from systemic infection. Plague symptoms. At the beginning of the illness, both men and women develop swellings in the groin or armpits, growing to the size of a common apple or egg. People called them gavocioli, plague buboes. Only a few recovered, and almost all died on the third day after the appearance of these signs, some sooner, others later. Giovanni Boccaccio, Decameron. If the bacteria reached the lungs, pneumonic plague spread through coughing and killed nearly all exposed. Bubonic plague killed 60 to 70% of infected before antibiotics. Pneumonic plague left almost no survivors. City under siege plague turned cities into fortresses, besieged internally by infection. Healthy people feared anyone already sick. Authorities often delayed quarantines, hoping the danger might pass. Epidemics were seen as foreign. The 1627 plague in Lorraine was called Hungarian, in 1636 Swedish, in Toulouse 1630 Milanese. The disaster instilled such fear in men and women that brothers abandoned brothers, uncles their nephews, sisters their brothers, and often wives their husbands. In performing this service, they often lost their lives along with their wages. Giovanni Boccaccio, Decameron priests, and doctors sometimes stayed and died alongside. London. From plague to fire. In the winter of 1664 to 1665, the Great Plague began in London. The disease was initially slow to spread, but with warmer weather, it erupted with full force. The Great Plague of 1664 to 1666 claimed 70,000 to 100,000 lives, about 20% of the city's population. The plague arrived through ports with infected rats, goods, and clothing. I had to consider two important circumstances. On one hand, I needed to continue my business and trade. On the other hand, I had to think about saving my own life in the face of a great disaster. And one morning, a completely clear thought came to me. If what is happening to us occurs only by the will of God, I should consider whether this is a sign from above, clearly showing that heaven wills me to stay. Daniel Defoe, A Journal of the Plague Year. The epidemic peaked in the summer of 1665. Weekly mortality reports, bills of mortality, showed thousands of deaths. Cemeteries overflowed, and victims were thrown into mass graves. Protective measures included killing dogs and cats, which backfired, burning incense, and smoking tobacco. The most effective measure remained isolating the sick and quarantining the healthy. All ships arriving from infected or potentially infected areas had to wait 30 days before their crew was allowed to go ashore. Hence, the word quarantine. This is how the first quarantine stations and isolation hospitals, lazarettos, were established to protect cities from the plague. Inside cities, individual houses, streets, or neighborhoods were isolated. In London, houses with infected residents were boarded up from the outside, and guards were posted at the doors to prevent the sick from escaping. However, residents regularly tried to deceive the guards. Today, I sadly discovered on Drury Lane 2 or 3 houses with a red cross on the doors and the inscription, "God have mercy on us." Samuel Pepys' diary, June 7, 1665. I went out for a short walk and noticed that the door of the unfortunate Dr. Burnett's house was boarded up. Samuel Pepys' diary, June 11, 1665. The plague claimed thousands of lives. Newspapers published bills of mortality, and the number of deaths grew at a frightening rate. Cemeteries were overcrowded, and victims were thrown into mass graves. Desperate people grasped at any means of protection: amulets, miracle doctors, perfect preventive pills against the plague, the best fortifying remedy against unhealthy air, unparalleled plague mixture, and the only effective healing water. I put on a colorful silk coat, a fine thing, and also a new curled wig. There are rumors that for making wigs, they use the hair of plague victims. Samuel Pepys' diary, September 3, 1665. God, how deserted and gloomy the streets are. How many unfortunate sick everywhere. They say in Westminster there is not a single doctor left and only one apothecary. Samuel Pepys' diary, October 16, 1665. The epidemic began to subside by late autumn. In February 1666, King Charles II returned to London, but the city soon faced another disaster. On September 2nd, a fire broke out at Thomas Farriner's bakery, destroying over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and St. Paul's Cathedral. After the fire, streets were widened to make the city safer in future epidemics. I, with Lord Brookner and Mrs. Williams, in a carriage. The gatekeepers bow low. Beggars run from all sides. The city has revived compared to how it was. Samuel Pepys' diary, January 5, 1666. Epidemics always spread via roads, traders, and transportation. An example is cholera in the 19th century. It quickly reached Europe and America thanks to faster transport. Outbreaks of disease show that progress makes cities more vulnerable to infections.